remember. Thank you, Barb. I appreciate that. And if you're on Zoom, if you want to write your questions about the presentation in the chat box, then you can ask them at the end. So if you were at the Shell Show last year and you saw the really cool lighthouse with the little ecosystems all around it, and it was very cool. This was Dr. Mithriel MacKay's lighthouse that you made yourself, right? Yeah, very cool. So anyway, if you saw that, you've seen a little bit of her work, but I'm going to tell you what else she does. Dr. Mithriel MacKay is a marine biologist working as the director of the Marine and Coastal Ecology Research Center, a nonprofit organization. Her research includes a broad interest in cetacean behavioral ecology, the study of whales, dolphins, and porpoises, and their role in marine ecosystems. Research questions are aimed at understanding individual and social group cetacean behaviors with an integrated approach that includes ethology, evolutionary biology, acoustics, anatomy, and physiology. She is an enthusiastic amateur collector of shells. She has been known to leave all her personal items behind to make room for shells collected in remote and deep sea field excursions. Now, that is my kind of woman. Forget the clothes, bring the shells, right? Yeah, I love it. She asked me today, she said she wanted to go shelling. She said, is it okay if I come in a little windblown? Because I don't want to miss the shelling. I said, hey, windblown and more shells, that sounds like a good deal. We'll take windblown. Dr. MacKay has a doctorate in marine biology, a master's in marine resources management, a bachelor of science in clinical laboratory medicine, and she worked as a paramedic in the Texas Hill Country. She specializes in creating and teaching dynamic education platforms for students, interns, and citizen scientists with an interest in marine ecology. So, Dr. MacKay, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome. Let's all give her a big hand. Yeah, we'll put this down so you can see my face. I hid my notes under here too. I don't know how I'm going to entertain you after Debbie's act. That's a tough act to follow, but thanks for having me here. When I was at the Shell Show last year, and I recognized some of you in the room, and I was asked to, if I'd be willing to do something, and I said, you know what, I'm not that great at shells. I collect a lot of them. I have wicked ADHD, and every time I go in the fields with my whales, I bring shells home. And I do it so much that I haven't identified all of them yet because I just haven't organized and cataloged, and I don't know what a lot of them are. But I know whales, and I can connect the dots when it comes to whales. So if you're good for that and understanding what whales and conchology and malacology have in common, I'm game. I'm part of that. And I have a crazy ADHD brain. So I tend to pull in concepts in different ways and I get bored easily. So what I'm hoping to do today, considering it's Super Bowl Sunday and my attire is all Mother Nature after several hours on Algiers this morning with some great shelling, is give you an introduction on some of the concepts that connect whales and shells together and hopefully spark some interest. And then if we want to follow up, we can talk and have some questions. So if you're game, that's where I'd like to start. And it's absolutely true that I leave everything out. I tend to find little things for work sometimes, and I have weight limits. If I have to choose between my clothes and sleeping bags and pretty much everything but my camera or shells, everything else gets donated to wherever I am so I can get shells home. So I know that some of you can relate to that. So Connor, is this the beginning of what you have for me? If I just go right, we're good to go?
So Debbie gave you a great introduction to me, a little bit about me, and I'm sure you can think of 100 things that shells and whales have in common, right? Or maybe not. This picture is shells from Australia on one of the beaches in Western Australia. And this is a humpback whale picture I took of in Puerto Rico. So I thought that would be a great place to start. And I put some classification up there, how do we sort and talk about things. And you can see I have Animalia in the middle, which is animals in the animal kingdom. And I compared shells and whales. And if you go down to see which classifications they have in common, absolutely nothing. Absolutely, positively nothing. After we say that they both belong to the same kingdom, Animalia, they're animals. So there's quite a few of the shells that I put up there, and down the bottom of the slide, you can see cetacea, which includes whales, dolphins, and porpoises. So they don't overlap at all when it comes to classification. And I'm sure some of you probably know this better than I do, but with DNA sampling now, classification is shifting all the time as well. One of the things I like about shells, though, and one of the reasons I started collecting them in the field, was I would look at shells on one side of the world and another side of the world, and they looked alike. And I couldn't tell the difference. At first, it took me a long time. But aha, this is a great way to teach my students how things change to look the same over time, millennia, right, through evolution. And they can be in completely different places, but end up looking the same. And so I am going to connect the dots to whales eventually. But first, we need some background. So this is kind of a diagram of what it looks like in the ocean. And one of the ways we refer to different parts of the ocean, and this is by depth. And so the description of all of these zones are talking about mostly how light penetrates the ocean. And you can see from all the silhouettes in there, we can talk about which animals, which organisms are in different zones. So we know if we look at these different zones and we talk about mollusks, then they're at the surface, right, in the shallowest places. I can tell you that from today, from being on the beaches, to some of the deepest places in the water. And depending on the life stage that they're in, they may be floating in the water column, right, like larvae. So we can find them in every zone. And you may or may not know, even some of the deepest zones. And whales also do that. So they do occupy the same areas of the ocean. So there's potential for them to have something that overlaps. So they're abundant, they're near shore, they're deep sea. There's different amounts of light that interact with them. They're in the water column in different stages. Trying to follow along on my laptop at the same time, so I have to turn too much on you. But one of the things that we know about all organisms is that they eat what's in the neighborhood. Whatever the resources are that's available to them is a big determination of how they interact with their environment. And that's what ecology is, right? So if we're talking about some of these mollusks in one place in the world, depending on what their resources are there, is what they'll use and how they develop to take advantage of those resources. And whales do the same thing. So that's a really important thing to consider when you start looking at things interacting with each other. But I did want to talk about something you may not know about. This is an example of a cold sea. And this is something a lot of people don't know exists. In the Earth's crust, there are places that some of the gases can escape. And generally, it's methane is the biggest one in sulfates. And that can be used as a source of nutrients for some organisms, including mollusks. When some of these seeps occur, if we go and explore and find them, and they're not super common, then you can start to look at whole different ecosystems, different communities that are based around those. And we find that the mollusks that go near these are taking advantage of something different. And they do it in phases depending on where they are. So the pictures I put up here, you'll see there's two worms with one of the mollusks up in the top right-hand corner. And I'm not going to try to pronounce the names of the mollusks. I can do that for whales, but not so much for mollusks. The thing about this is that they're usually deep sea. And because the communities are different, wherever they are on the earth, whatever the resources are, wherever these animals can move, we have these small isolated communities. And there's been some questions. In fact, I think when Kevin talked last month, one of the things he said that I picked up during the talk was that there were some shells that were found in places like how did they get to these isolated places in the bottom of the ocean? How are these communities forming when it doesn't seem to be a way with distance to get in these places and have these isolated communities? And this is one example of that, wherever these seeps appear. So if you have larval phases of mollusks and they're floating in the ocean, then they have the potential to find a nutrient resource and get there. All right, so cold seeps are deep, but we also have, I remember you look at this, hydrothermal vents. So these are deep sea too, but these are warm places. And with hydrothermal vents, you're going to find other resources that are there. So these, again, they're isolated. These are areas where cold water has seeped into these deep ocean ridges, and that gets superheated. And when it gets superheated by the magma that's underneath there, it picks up all the minerals that are under there, and it brings them back up to the surface in places that can escape. These are things that are called black smokers, and it looks like something that would be heated up from the core of the earth and brought up. And in this case, there's, again, sulfates that are in there. So we have different organisms that'll go over here, and a lot of mollusks take advantage of this. What's really interesting about this deep sea environment is that the mollusks that are there form a community that sort of sorts itself by how much sulfate it can tolerate. So the closer they get to the smokers, you get different species of mollusks that I can move away. We still haven't gotten to whales, have we? So we're getting closer. We're getting closer. We are. And offshore wind turbines have become a big controversy in a lot of places. We have places that have had them for many, many years. And for me, I think about places like Holland where people go visit to see windmills. But when we start putting wind turbines in the water, people get very concerned. They're big, they're changing, they're improving. That will change dramatically in the not too distant future. But one of the things that has happened that's been unexpected is that they're seeding new ecosystems. That the base of these wind turbines are starting to attract things that will stick to them and grow. And that should probably remind all of us of things like oyster, right? That we know that you can seed an oyster bed if you have lava oyster. If you put out old oyster shells, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I know up by me, I live 3 hours north of here. We take those old shells and put them in bags and make reefs close to shore in areas that have had some impacts on human activity. And we let those oyster larvae cling to it and seed whole new oyster beds. And oysters are great at filtering. We know a lot of the bivalves are great at filtering, right? And it's cleaning the water dramatically. And that's what wind turbines are starting to do. But even more than that, once, if you build it, they will come. That's all about wind turbines. So you get it started, and now we've got a community of some mollusks coming in. And they're the potato chips of the sea for those of you that are my age. Everybody likes them and you can't eat just one. So if you seed these things and then you have the predators come in, right? So they're filtering the water, they're seeding it. Colonies are growing of different mollusks. And then suddenly we're finding other organisms are attracted to it. We've got crabs that'll come in. And a lot of these are economically important species that are growing and being seeded in these microenvironments. So before we go, oh my God, that's a terrible thing. Maybe it isn't. And now that we've had some hints on some of this happening, there are some clever engineers, bioengineers that are noticing which of these structures are attracting more of these organisms. So if we're going to put these in the water and get renewable energy, then why don't we build them so that we can build it and they will come? But we still haven't gotten to whales, right? So it goes. And by the way, they don't hurt whales. I know that all of you probably see on the internet, every time there's a wind farm coming up, I get hit with a lot of emails that say, that's terrible, they're killing whales. They don't jump in front of whales. The sun doesn't bother whales. So if they're not bothering whales. So I still haven't connected the dots yet. But we're close. We're really close. But we can't talk about the ocean without talking about plankton in the ocean. This is really important because this is the bottom of the food chain. And in order for me to connect whales with mollusks for you, then I have to talk about the food chain. That's the only way we can get there between the two of them. So we have zooplankton, the ones that have plants, small plants that a lot of organisms in the ocean like to eat. And they migrate in the water column so that they can come up and take advantage of that sunshine so that they can have photosynthesis and reproduce that way. And depending on what nutrients are there, will be whatever those blooms of these phytoplankton are in your area. And then something has to eat phytoplankton to be part of the food chain, and that's zooplankton. And zooplankton are the small animals that are, it's one term for a whole cluster of tiny microscopic animals. And those also change that composition of zooplankton changes depending on where they are, because you eat what's in your neighborhood. But the really cool thing about this is some of the zooplankton are going to be mollusk larvae. Some of the things that make a difference to us that collect shells and to whatever's in the ocean. So in order to get these big clouds of all of these plankton, the zooplankton and the phytoplankton, we take a look at all the resources and then we see what else happens. And you probably know more about this with algae as well than you think, because one of the things that these organisms, the phytoplankton really like, the plants, are nutrients. And a lot of those nutrients are runoff. And especially in Florida, we get a lot of news about things that run off into the water, right? And those things are a problem. Well, they're a problem because they feed things. And so that's one of the things we have to keep in mind. If you feed something and they come, how much of them do you really want there before you have a totally different problem, right? But what eats these? Well, zooplankton gets scooped up by small fish, especially in nursery areas, because they're little. So little fish eat those. And what eat little fish? Bigger fish, right? And bigger fish. And then you get to other animals like the animals that I study. Some whales will eat those bigger fish as well. And then we start to get to these megafauna, right? The bigger animals. I'm like juggling three things here and trying to stay organized a bit. Okay, so now we're into what really matters. Not really. If I leave all my clothes behind for shelves, I can't really say that. But this is what excites me. This is what rocks my world. Looking at these animals out in the water never gets old, ever gets old. And I can never look at them and say, what are they doing? And not just wonder what's going on underneath the water that I can't see. Where are they? Who are they? How many are they? Why are they here? And we have a lot of whales that are around us. I don't know if you know that, but we have a lot around Florida as well. So let's start talking about these and see how I can connect the dots for you. And again, I want to do some classification so this makes a little bit of sense to you, because we need to talk about what eats what here. And cetacea, that is the umbrella that has all the whales in them. And dolphins belong under this group as well. We have toothed whales and we have baleen whales. And the toothed whales include the whales you think of, like killer whales, sperm whales, they have teeth. But we also include the dolphins. They are whales, and it has to do with the naming of and the classification of all these animals. I would love, one question people always ask me is how many species of these are there? And I can't tell you because it changes every 2 years at our meetings, and every time there's DNA samples taken, and we think we know what the animals are, but we really don't, because DNA says, oh no, that's not what you think it is. This classification has always been by description. Right? You take a look at something, you take a look at a mollusk, you look at it and you describe it, you draw it, you say, and I have a heavy Boston accent, I can hear it coming out, I'm tired of selling. You draw it and then you say, okay, these must be similar. They have a lot of similar characteristics. And then we learn more about it and we say, these are really kind of different. And then we learn more about it and we say, these are really kind of different. And then we do DNA and we go, oh, these are really different, but they look a lot alike. And a lot of that has happened with cetacea as well. So we have these toothed whales, but we also have baleen whales. So the next slide is a really good picture of a baleen whale. That's a humpback whale doing what's called trap feeding. But if you look in the top of its mouth, you see these things that kind of look like toothbrushes that hang down at the top of its mouth, and they're bristly and they for filter feeding. And just as an aside, because this is coming up more often, their throats no bigger than a dinner plate on the biggest whale. With the sperm whales, no bigger than a dinner plate. So if anybody ever says you're going to get swallowed by a whale, and make that reference, can't happen. You can get scooped up by a whale. These belong to a group of whales that have big throat pleats that expand, and they can scoop you up, but they know they can't swallow you, and they don't want to swallow you, so they spit you out again. So that has happened. There's a few news cases that we can talk about and why it happens in those things another time. But you can see the picture on top is a picture of krill, which you've probably heard of. They're oil-filled, terrific things for a lot of animals in the sea, including baleen whales to eat. So we're getting closer to the big things and the little things. So baleen whales are mysticetes. Mysticete means mustache whale for that reason. And I brought this here because most people don't know we have a Florida whale. Did you guys know that we have a whale that's only found in Florida? And it was discovered and named not that many years ago and immediately put on the endangered species list. And this is one of those examples of, we've been calling this something else for a really long time. But Rice's whale is Florida's whale. And if you draw a line pretty much from Tampa over to about New Orleans, about Louisiana, there's a ridge and a plateau that's what I call the armpit of Florida, right under the water on that ledge. And that's where Rice's whale is. That's the habitat. So there are not many Rice's whales that are left. And once we discovered them, they became very important. So we have a group of people here that spend a lot of time studying Rice's whales. But we also have a lot of other whales that are big and small. We have killer whales here. We have Gulf killer whales here. There's sperm whales in the Gulf. We have them wash up last year before, I think, in Venice. I don't know if you guys remember that, but I was down on the beach with the people that were helping them do some of the studies on that. But there are a lot of species here. So mollusks and whales, their interactions are relevant for us. So now we can talk about some places in the ocean that whales are. I've given you, kind of a brief overview of where you find mollusks and maybe some interesting things like wind farms that maybe you didn't think about. We could find them that could improve them. Well, we needed to have more colonies of them. But now I need to bring whales into this and let you know that in the same deep sea environment, there are other ecosystems that interact, that have both species overlap. And one of them is whale falls. So whales die. That's the way it is, right? They die. And nobody's ever really spent a lot of time thinking about what happens to them when they die. We sort of make the assumption they get consumed. But they get consumed in ways that we didn't really expect until not that long ago. And and of course, because now we have high tech, right? The more our tech advances, the more we get to see the ocean and the more we learn. And one of the ways is these deep sea events where a whale falls all the way to the bottom become oases of nutrients for a lot of different organisms. And across the bottom, you can see there are stages of whale falls where they come in and these different organisms feed. So we get the big organisms that come in first, sharks, hagfish, crabs, that'll come in and feed off, and octopus, that'll come in and feed off the flesh, whatever's left from whatever happened between the time that whale was alive and the time that whale's carcass hit the bottom of the floor. And these whale falls, by the way, can last decades to maybe even up to 100 years. So this little oasis, this little community that's seeded by a whale in the middle of nowhere, right? So maybe it's not as if we know, all the whales would be found here, so all the whale falls would be here. Whales move. And, we think about going on vacation, maybe 3.5 hours is a good drive, to just settle in and for me to come down to Sanibel and do some shelling. Well, distance to whales is a little bit different. So along the migration route, some of these whales, like humpback whales that I study a lot, killer whales will do this as well, and all over the world, they'll migrate 4,000 miles, and gray whales probably migrate more than that, longer than that. We know that because we can identify some of these individual whales while they're alive, and then some of my friends will see them in, Iceland, when I see it in Puerto Rico. So we know that. whales die all along that route. But there's not really a whole lot else there in the blue water. But once these things hit the floor of the sea, there's an opportunity. So possibly something worth pondering is this the stepping stone for mollusk communities and other organisms, some of these crabs, sharks move, we know that. They move distances, so maybe not so much of a mystery, but how far does a mollusk move when it moves? Some of them don't at all, right? They pass. And some of them will move a little bit, but thousands of miles, not so much. So perhaps something that's a deep sea event like these whale falls will do that and becomes a valuable resource. And aha, now I finally get to connect all the dots for you. And then we really get to talk about why we should care about that. But whales do more than eat. And what whales eat depends on what they're able to eat. So toothed whales will eat fish, maybe other marine mammals, sharks sometimes, right? You've seen killer whales, I'm sure. Those of you that are on social media have heard about killer whales that will eat parts of sharks, depending on you eat. It's in your neighborhood, so it depends on where the neighborhood is. Baleen whales that filter tend to like smaller organisms, small fish and krill and things like that. And the places that those tend to be in large enough amounts for big enough animals like blue whales, fin whales, humpback whales to eat are going to be on feeding grounds that have a lot of nutrients. So that tends to be up in the colder waters of in North America. We're talking about like the higher latitude. So when these whales migrate up to Massachusetts, Greenland, Iceland, Canada, they're looking for things that tend to be in big amounts in those areas and they eat. But all things that eat must rid all of the parts they don't need in their body and don't want anymore somehow. So whales will poop into their environment, and what's left are nutrients. And since whales move, so do the nutrients that they have in their body left over from what they eat. So picture this. You have a big whale that dives down, let's look at a sperm whale, dives down deep and eats really 2,000, 3,000 feet under the sea and has a big meal. And then he comes up to the surface. And guess what he does at the surface? He's pooped at the surface and he's got nitrogen, phosphates, and iron are the big three nutrients. And guess what means that? The littlest organisms in the water that I spent all this time talking about said I would connect. So whales are finding their own food chain. And they're moving these nutrients in areas that have them in a different form, or living body, and they're bringing them to places that they wouldn't be otherwise, up to the surface, or maybe a few thousand miles. So now we have whale falls in the deep sea that are providing opportunities for some mollusks. And we also have whales that are finding the pump all over the world by moving these nutrients up to the surface. And so they're feeding the zooplankton and the phytoplankton. And when we get these blooms, that just finds everything else, because when you have those, then you get the small fish that eat all that stuff, right? And then the bigger fish that eat the smaller fish, and so forth. So we keep going and can change the diets and what happens. Now, what happens if something in the ocean changes? All of this changes, right? So what happens if whales have been feeding offshore 25 miles and suddenly the currents change and their food moves, let's say it's a humpback whale, let's say their clouds of fish move closer to shore. Then guess what else moves closer to shore? Whatever eats it, right? Because if the whales don't move to get their food, then there's no more whales. So they detect it, they get closer to shore, they follow their food, they eat their food. Guess where the nutrients are? Wherever the whales go. And so when we talk about things that change in the ocean, it's very dynamic. And some of these things that change are not a big deal. But on the other hand, if things really warm up and all their prey starts to move in different places, or then the horizon dynamic starts to change. And that becomes perhaps a bigger problem than you might think, or a bigger puzzle. Because I like to think of these as all the pieces that go together. And so I like this graphic a lot. Oops, I did it for you. I could do it. There you go. I didn't make this graphic. All the credits are on these slides because I'm very fussy about, making sure that we give credit to people who do it. But they did such a good job on this. I didn't see a reason to do it. But I want to walk you through it. And when I walk you through it, I want you to really think about some of these things and why it matters and why whales and mollusks being connected together can really change the dynamics of the ocean and really go showering eventually. So the big green cloud in the middle is the phytoplankton. Remember, those are the small plant-like organisms that migrate from the water column up to the sunlight during the day, photosynthesize, and go back down. They do that, by the way, probably to avoid predators. That's why they move. If they're always found in the same place, they're always going to be eaten in the same place. And they do that. But the big thing is if you look on top of it, and I don't know if this is really, no, I guess it looks pretty good. Atmospheric carbon dioxide is what's showing on the slide. And so what I want you to keep in mind is that carbon and heat are just interconnected. There's no separating them. Wherever the carbon goes, that's where the heat is. And we don't want too much of it up in the atmosphere. We want this balance to continue where we've got atmospheric carbon and we've got carbon in other places. And the ocean is the place that takes care of most of the carbon that needs to be taken care of and kind of buries it out of the way so that we don't have to worry about it being up in the atmosphere too much. But in this case, we've got phytoplankton that releases carbon dioxide. So we've got all this atmospheric carbon, and the way you want to reduce that is you don't want that to get too big. So we need more zooplankton to do that. Well, whales are good key to that, because if they feed the phytoplankton, then there's the potential for the zooplankton to get bigger, and the zooplankton get eaten, and all these fish that eat it, and all these other organisms in this whole chain, and then eventually they die and they go to the bottom of the ocean and they stay there. Anytime carbon becomes part of an animal, or it sinks and it stays where it is, then it doesn't cause a problem in the atmosphere. That's how the ocean takes care of all the temperature of the planet. That's the key to this thing. And so the larval stages in the zooplankton for mollusks are there, but we also know there's a predator-prey dynamic here as we go up the food chain for mollusks, right? Lots of other animals eat them. So that's a big deal, and that's really important. And what this graphic really shows is how many different animals will eat these things. And you can see it on my copy. And if you look over to the left-hand side, that's talking about a whale shark. A dead animal at the bottom of the ocean being consumed, providing an oasis for other organisms that are there, like mollusks, long-term, are also grabbing carbon out of the water. So it's a big deal to have all that cycle through and have whales feeding and priming all of this. But then we have humans. We have to throw in the human thing because humans are part of this whole thing. We can't say, we're not apart from it. And a lot of times I think people forget we're part of this food chain and our activity is what we do. Sometimes we're a little bit more intrusive than the colonies and the communities and the ecological systems that are, the ecosystems that are there would prefer. But we impact everything, but we don't just impact it negatively, we impact it positively. So some of the things that people don't realize is whaling actually had a change, or very likely had a change in the Earth's temperature by pulling out those whales from the ocean, thousands and hundreds of thousands of whales during the years of whaling. And whaling started at least from the 1500s. So it was really big in the 1700s and 1800s. All the whales that came out meant what? No whale cells, right? No organic matter tied up, so the carbon isn't in the body. And so what happened to those mollusk communities that moved around? I don't know. I don't know if the fossil record even shows it. I'm not a mollusk expert, but I'd like to talk to some and see what they might think had happened. Because whaling, there are some people that did the math and calculated the difference that pulling whales out of the water made as far as the temperature in the ocean. But I like to think a bigger picture. What difference did it make in all the communities that it impacted, all the way through the food chain? And then let's talk about fisheries, because we know mollusks are a big part of fisheries, right? So we've impacted the fisheries as well. But then we put up wind farms, and now we're starting to feed them again. So we can bump it the other way. because we know how they're interconnected now, deep sea or whatever. And we know commercial fish farms have an impact on things because now they're introduced into the food chain. We've got oyster reefs that filter. So if we damage them, we have a problem, but we know how to fix that now. So we can do that. And we talk about recreation, right? So if we get out there and we're on water skis and boats and we drive whales away and they don't want to come back to that area anymore, then what happens with this whole food chain? If the whales are bringing up all those nutrients from the bottom by diving down and eating and coming back up and providing all those nutrients, what does other human activity do if we drive them out of that area? Changes things a lot, right? And I don't know if you're aware of mussel farms, but mussels that are grown, that are suspended in the water column, to me, they always remind me of stacking up like the skids that you can get from pallets, you know, they look like that. But a lot of these mussel farms in different parts of the world are put into bays. And when you do that, sometimes they intrude on areas that whales go into, dolphins especially. So if you have too many in there, mussels are an economically important species of mollusk. Yeah, we harvest them, they're a fishery. They really tie together a lot of things, but if you have dolphins that are in there all the time and the mussel farms are doing good, is it possible that those dolphins are actually providing nutrients for those mussels? And if you crowd them out and they leave, will it make a difference? I don't know, but it's a really good thing to investigate, right? And keep an eye on before you do all these things. So it's complicated. That's what I really wanted to know. It's complicated. They are tied together. Every time I take a shell out of the ocean, I actually have a little ping and feel like taking this calcium out of here. Am I stopping sometimes? My impact is small, but I'm one of many people that love shells. They're a big room full of shells. So I don't know how much fields I should have or not. Obviously not enough to stop because I was at the beach today. But I think about it, and I think it's really good to think about it, how interconnected everything is. And that's what I really wanted to give you. And it doesn't end there. This is for another day, but I wanted to point out things like there are other animals that are really a big piece of this food chain. We know that sea otters love mollusks, love bivalves especially. You might not know they have pockets under their arms and they get their favorite rocks for smashing open their clams and they keep it in their pocket and they keep it. Yeah, they really do. So that's their thing. And it makes them great when it comes to hunting them. And that's a walrus up in, I think it's the up right. Yeah, that's fishing around in the sediment to find the mollusks to eat. And they don't crush them. Those husks are to help them haul out of the ice and fight. But I saw a mother and a pup walrus on the job I was doing where the pup was tired. It was like a 2-year-old pup. It was big. Pups and walruses, I think they should be renamed to something else. But it was big and it got up on the land and it was tired and it just flopped. Can you imagine seeing something that big flop? And mom was still on the berm trying to get up. And every set of waves that reset goosed her with cold water up in Alaska. And she was not happy. She wanted that pup to move up. So apparently tusks are really good to put in the butt of your pup and scoot them up the beach so you can get out of the water and not be goosed by the waves. But what they do is they find these clams and then they suck the meat. They suck the animal out of the clams very efficiently with their mouth. So they don't break them open. They're just amazing when it comes to suction and getting those animals out of there. So again, you know, what do they put in the food chain if things change? Something for another day, but I wanted to leave it for you. The other picture is a gray whale. You may have seen pictures of this on social media, people going out in inflatable boats in areas off, especially California. And the whales will come up to the boat for attention, which, by the way, whale's choice, I'm all for that. Yeah, whales come to you, no problem with that. But what you might not know is they feed several different ways. They have short baleen, and you can always look in an animal's mouth and see, you'll get some good ideas of what they eat by looking at the shape of whatever it is they used to eat. And they have short, thick, very bristly baleen, like a big, thick toothbrush. And that's because they go along the mud on the bottom and they scoop up the mud and they sift out the microscopic animals, copepods, the biggest one, and they feed off of it. So that great big thing eats some of the littlest things, and then guess what? Gives them back the nutrients so we can do it all over again. And those divots that he creates in the water, and you can see them, stirs up things, and guess what? We have more mollusk communities. And when you build it, they will come. So if you have more mollusk communities, everything that eats them goes up there. So that's what I have for you. That's my introduction. And I know it was a long way around to connect the biggest thing to the smallest thing, but the point was to let you know that everything actually does interconnect and maybe give you some things you had never heard about before that you might find interesting as well. So this picture, before I take the questions, if you have any, I think we are the only people that had our picture taken by two whales. This was a National Geographic special we did with Ocean X and BBC, and we tagged the killer whale and a humpback whale calf. And they ended up using that little boat that we're on. I'm the one right in the middle of the blue of the camera, taking a picture of the whale. So I have a picture of this killer whale. So I'm taking a picture of it as it's taking a picture of me with the camera. We put suction cups on its back with. So I just think this is like one of the most fun things. Like, who else has a picture taken by a whale that I have a picture of, and I can and with timestamps, so I can pull the exact frame and say, that picture is when you took my picture. So I just thought that you might enjoy that. And I'm happy to answer your questions. I do need to let you know, I hope this is different. I hope I connected some dots. I hope the next time you pick up a show, it didn't make you feel guilty after all of that. But maybe you'll think about when you hear about wind turbines going up, maybe it's not so bad. You know, if we do a good job and we get better at it, and maybe we can make things better the more we learn, the more I practice that way. I do need to tell you I'm deaf and I read lips. So I asked Debbie to give me a hand with your questions. Because of the distance, I may or may not understand what you're saying. So, and I hear very little, but yeah. Am I involved with? Oh, no? No, I'm up north of Tampa in Spring Hill. So our research center is a totally different entity. We don't know each other. It's a small world, but no, I don't live with them. I did that good a job, huh? Okay, help me out. I'm sorry. I'm okay. What is the impact of the northern right whale falling below reproducible numbers as part of your question? That's number two. Let's start with that one since I remembered that one. Was there anything in particular you wanted to know the impact on, or just in general? Well, I don't know that I have a really good answer for that. And a lot of these questions about whales, I'm going to tell you, I almost always start with, I don't know, but here's what I do know. And that's what one of these are. So having the population be so small, anything that these right whales are involved in is going to be impacted. They're filter feeders on the surface. So they eat some of the smallest things. And they've been low in numbers for a very long time. So pretty much whatever was going to happen in the food chain probably has already been impacted to the degree it will. They're long-living animals, and obviously losing anything with diversity is going to be a problem in the long run. But I can't really tell you what the impact is, except that there'll be yet another extinct species in this fifth mass extinction. And the other part had something to do with microplastics. And I didn't understand what your question was about that. Right. The impact on I'll repeat it, but just the last piece. I just didn't hear your last word.
The impact of microplastics on shellfish.
On everything.
On the whole
Okay.
quality of the ocean.
Okay. So to reword it for people that are on Zoom and they can hear it, you asked me about microplastics and that you already knew that we're finding microplastics in tissues of all animals. And obviously it's going to have an impact on some things. I think we're just starting to understand what that impact is. Part of it is that we've ingested it, so we're finding it's in all of our bodies too. Some of it may not make a difference that we can even notice for a very long period of time, and it's going to be complicated by other things. But the immediate impact is really hard to determine. It's the bigger microplastics we know, because they tend to choke animals. So those are the obvious ones. But the ones in the tissues, whether or not they interact with things, I don't think we really fully understand what that impact is. So I don't have a good answer for that. My thoughts would be, and the things I wonder about is when microplastics take up space in any organism's body, what is it replacing? What isn't there that should be, that's normally there? When whales die, they shift how they hold on to oxygen. They don't do it the way you would think. They don't hold the breath the way we do. You keep it in their lungs. They shift it into myoglobin in their muscles. So if their muscles are taken up by microplastics, are they going to be less able to dive the way they would, or will they adapt? And so I really don't think we have a good answer for that.
Okay, the question was in the last 2 weeks, whales have appeared up at both brands, and is that unusual?
Are you talking about the right whales? I think it was they were right whales that showed up. It's not unusual. I think it's exciting and I love it. A couple of years ago, we had a killer whale that somebody took a really terrible photo with their cell phone because it was far away offshore and sent it to me. They found me on social media and sent it to me and said, yeah, from what I can tell, that looks like a killer whale. And there was a big debate with my colleagues about, is it really a killer whale? And they study killer whales here, but it's a killer whale. It is a killer whale. And then my colleagues who said, nah, we think it's a bottlenose dolphin. A couple of days later, a killer whale stranded. And everybody was shocked that, the people around us said it was actually a killer whale. I didn't know there were killer whales here. And my comment to that applies to your question is, I don't care if it was a killer whale or not that we saw in that video. What I care about is all the people that said, oh my gosh, I didn't know we had killer whales. We do have killer whales. What are they doing here? What are they eating? What do we do? How many are there? Is there something going on that we need to react to? Can they come here more often? Did something change that brings them in? That is what I cared about, that people got excited. And so the right whales that are coming around, is it unusual? No. There's a lot of discussion with humpback whales in the Caribbean. The numbers have rebounded since protections were put in since the 1980s. And now we're seeing them in places we didn't before. So when I started doing my research off Puerto Rico in 2010, I saw them in places that people didn't know they were there. And they look like nursery areas. And they are, because they go down to the Caribbean to make babies and have babies. And so now are they repopulating areas that are new? Or are they populating areas that were populated by these whales before? And so right whales, the ones that we're seeing last year, you might remember, there's a pair that's well known that went from Georgia all the way around Florida and appeared off the coast of Florida and then went over towards, I think it went as far as Louisiana before they hung out for a while and teased all my colleagues that were studying them down here, going back and forth and back and forth. And they were well known and identified, and then came back around and they go back up north again. It's normal. That is part of what they do, but there's a few more than there were not that long ago. So perhaps they're just going back to reefs that they already knew. These animals live a very long time. Or perhaps with the changing oceans, they're finding resources that they're taking advantage of. So it isn't new, but it's great that people are seeing it for the first time and going, wow. And if you can see it, by all means, see it. By all means, that's where it is. You'll find a lot of times people don't report it because you don't want everybody's boat heading out to some endangered world, right? But by all means, yeah, take advantage of that and know that there are a lot of whales here, a lot, and it matters. Lifespan of a whale, did I get that?
Yep.
Reading lips is just really hard for me, especially at a distance. Depends on the whale. So if we're talking about dolphins, I'll make broad generalizations, okay? If we talk about dolphins, I usually think of them about our lifespan or shorter. So we can say 75, 50. 50 is probably a good number to keep in mind. But in general, think of a dolphin's lifespan, think of our lifespan as well. Some of the bigger whales probably live longer. There has been some discussion, and I'm not going to put this on video if my colleagues debate too much, about bowhead whales, which are the longest living. You will see social media talk about these whales can live over 200 years. Maybe they do. That's based on a harpoon head being found in a bowhead whale that was harvested by subsistence hunters. And when that harpoon head was aged, it was a couple hundred years old. So you're okay, well, this animal must have been an adult when they tried to catch, because you always go for the biggest whale, right? That's what the whale is for. So perhaps a couple hundred years old, and it's not really that unreasonable. But the only way you can determine, well, the only way until recently that you could determine the age of any of these was to see them when they were born and then to follow them until they died. And the problem with that is that we haven't really had the ability to study whales very well until about the mid 1950s. We just didn't have the way to dive or film underwater. And, now I have suction cup tags I put on there that listens to them and takes videos. So the longer we study them, the better we'll have an idea. However, there has been a technique that's come out less than 10 years where you can understand how cells age over time. When they reproduce, they change something very, very small. And that a couple of my colleagues collaborated and have been able to age some of these cetaceans and other animals by looking at the cells now and saying, oh, based on how this cell looks, it has divided so many times and made new cells. And so we can say this is what the age is. So that's a tough one. I mean, because I'm going to answer a lot. Yeah, I was born in 62. So 1950, starting to study these animals is not that long at all. And that was a very beginning. We good? Or Zoom? And brother? Zoom. Ready? Okay.
Are there any questions on Zoom?
No, just thank you for an interesting presentation. We really enjoyed it. Thanks so much.
I didn't hear that. I'm sorry.
He said, thank you so much for a really interesting presentation. They really enjoyed it.
Oh, I'm really
So,
glad.
yeah.
I'm glad that, I reached at least some people. Okay. The beach is taking away some of my voice.